It requires a double computer. One is a standard floppy, because they use these equipments normally for EEG measurement or shock therapy if they need to use shock therapy in the psychiatric wards. But with the induction of a special second floppy, which goes into a portion which is normally locked, this is the so-called orgiastic floppy, which induces which induces that state in the person who is wired up to this equipment, which now is not with big pads, but with very tiny little probes, which are 50 millimeters square. And in the certain appropriate points of the body, they are attached. I won't go into all of them, but all over the body in very critical nerve ganglia points. That person is pushed and thrown, if you will, into the orgastic state, and then by computer, they can change that person's mind, memory, programming, whatever. And when they're done, shut it off and install a final command that they don't remember anything that's happened. And then, of course, the person is released. No drugs, no messy techniques of the earlier Reichian form, and they can be done to a patient, whether it's a regular patient or an in-out patient, at any institution in the U.S. that has its equipment. Private hospitals that are not accepting federal funding do not have the law requirement to carry such equipment, but it is recommended that they do. But every major hospital that has federal funding has required by law to have at least one of these machines there, and they're usually kept under tight lock and key. This is how far some of the programming techniques have gone in this country, and this is only one example. A friend of mine who works in one of the hospitals upstate New York has personally seen the equipment, and he didn't say he'd seen it in operation, but I think probably he has. And he knows exactly how it works and exactly what is done to make it function, and that it can be used for those purposes. This took many years of research after Wilhelm Reich, and of course Reich died in 1957 in prison after he refused to reveal what classified government work he was working on in early '57. And the judge said his hands were tied. He had no choice but to commit him to prison unless he could show good cause why he should not, which meant he had to talk about his classified work, and he says, I can't. So he went to prison and died there. And of course came the famous FDA book burning of Wilhelm Reich's works. They went around and literally confiscated thousands of Reich books, and in a particularly vicious form of Nazi book burning, went ahead and burned the books. These have been republished since, most of them. I think there are a few that are still out of print and held privately. They didn't get all of them, of course, but they got them in the bookstores and the places where they were normally purchased.
So this was an Orwellian blacklisting?
It was a form of Orwellian blacklisting.
From the libraries and from the academic memory of this society.
Right. He was showing in all of his published works, which was not only his journals, his Journal of Orgonomy, but all of the various magazines, the books he had written and published, which were many, about a dozen. He was showing the function of orgone energy, not only in terms of the human body, but in terms of the atmosphere, weather control, smog, the relationships of smog and smoggy conditions in the Earth's atmosphere, how it was related to the loss of orgone energy in the atmosphere, and so forth.
Preston's tape is about secret weather control,
yes,
relation by orgone energy.
That's very true.
Balloon sons.
Well, radiosondes, as they call them.
Yeah.
And these radiosondes, believe it or not, were designed initially and built in breadboard form by Wilhelm Reich in his laboratory in Rangeley, Maine, and they were shipped down to that neat little laboratory in Long Island called Brookhaven, and there they were beaten into a production form and found out how they could produce them by the thousand fairly inexpensively, and they did. You know, Preston bought up nearly the entire stock in the United States, surplus, because they were banned after a certain point of time for being used. And the government didn't want the secret out that they were modifying the weather, not measuring it, because ground receiving stations were not built. All they built was the transmitter. So what do you do with the transmitter if you have no receiver? Well, you're doing something else. And they were. They were modifying the weather on an experimental basis. And the bigger units were capable of steering hurricanes. The AMT-6 started out with a little box, an AMT-2, then a slightly larger one with a white plastic bubble on the top, shaped with a point and then with a round section. And this AMT-4 was a little more powerful. And you used that as a more advanced form of weather control.
This is one of the earlier models.
And this was the earliest model, the AMT-2, which comprised of this white portion. It had the same antenna in it. It was run by a battery pack. And the rest of it was a different kind of a box structure, which contained some elements, namely three sensing elements. One was barometric pressure. The other was a special strip which actually sensed the amount of orgone energy in the atmosphere and converted it to an electrical signal. The other one sensed the amount of Dor energy, which is considered disintegrant orgone energy in the atmosphere, sensed that and gave it an electrical equivalent. And this went through a special modulator chopper system, and it was fed out in the transmitter, that small unit being one of the first ones, rather low power, which would then modify the weather experimentally in a limited area. They went from smaller to bigger boxes, and finally to the big AMT-6, which in its final form, which you can hardly find anymore, was in a cylindrical tube. It stood about this high off the floor, about that diameter, and had a huge antenna that stuck out at the bottom about that long. And the antenna was deployed after it was in flight, so to speak. The large ones were taken up in a plane and dropped off a parachute. The smaller units went up in a balloon.
So basically this is a manipulation of the micro and of the macro, from the mind to the weather.
Yes.
But to summarize here, so basically the Germans developed mind control through chemotherapy and hypnosis.
Correct. And they used very heavily scopolamine and other chemicals, but scopolamine was their principal weapon for hypnosis and mind bending, if you will. And it was used very effectively and with hypnosis to change a mind and do a programming under chemical means.
And later on, because not only the German rocket scientists got shared by the Allied powers after the Second World War, but so were all other secret scientists, so were their SS specialists, the Gestapo tutors, the propaganda ministry specialists that were shared by the Allied powers. And obviously all these mind control experiments were moved and continued in the other countries. Here in the United States, I've read a lot of books about parapsychology development in the Soviet Union. In Russia, of course, the other goes wrong. Always one would read about such advanced technologies developed in the United States, but obviously they were developed everywhere.
In all the major countries.
Yeah. And so here, on top of the chemotherapy and hypnosis, obviously in the United States were developed the other two methods, namely with implanted microchips and with some microwave radiation.
Yes, the earlier form of electrical stimulation using orgone Reichian techniques was one. Then they came to another technique under the more advanced mind control techniques, in which that was discovered by Preston Nichols sometime in the 80s. He found out about the other technique they were using, which was used and implemented at Montauk, the Phoenix Project. It consisted of a more or less standard low-powered radio transmitter. He replicated the whole system as an experimental test. He took a 250-watt surplus radio transmitter operating at high-frequency range, which says between 3 and 30 megahertz, designed a special modulator for it, and then had a tape recorder which had a tape recorded on it which said, in essence, quote, anyone hearing this message will call such and such phone number. And that phone number happened to be a Long Island phone number in the home of a friend of Preston's. He didn't use his number. Now, the criteria of this thing was none of the victims were to have and did have a radio receiver. What they were doing was broadcasting second-order energy, which the human mind picks up and decodes directly, as if it had a radio receiver. The human mind does have a radio receiver operating at second-order frequencies.
Telepathic receiver, basically.
Basically a telepathic type of receiver. And you can make it work just as well with an RF transmitter, a radio transmitter, if you know how to do the proper modulation on it, because what you're doing with a tube-type transmitter is you're already emitting not only ordinary electromagnetic waves, which is first order, but second, third, fourth order.